Well, folks, for those of you who are here for the first time in the last few weeks, we are grateful to have you as we pick up in this sermon series. We're on week 6 of 6. I don't usually do 6-week sermon series because I get bored of them after a few weeks. So, but this one was an exception because we wanted to finish tracing Paul's missionary journeys. And so we're going to wrap that up today by talking a little bit about his stop in a town called Miletus. And that's not where the story ends, but let's just do a quick little bit of review. And I'm just going to say, I'm going to really miss my maps because I've had a lot of fun with this. All right, in case you couldn't tell. All right, so here is the map of most of the Roman Empire in the first century. So in the time that Paul is traveling. Remember, down here in Jerusalem is basically home base for the Christian movement, of course. That's where the day of Pentecost happened, and from everything else, this is the launching point for the rest of the ministries. Paul's first missionary journeys took him to this region, in this area known as Asia Minor. We started our sermon series by talking about how after Paul did his ministry and started some small churches in the communities that I just circled, he then went back to Jerusalem, and then he went on foot for his second missionary journey, and he started in this place called Troas. He goes across, hits these cities of Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea. He goes down to Athens, Corinth. Last week we talked about how he went back to Jerusalem, but then made it again back to Ephesus. I got a lot of circling going on here, but we were in Ephesus. Then after the incident in Ephesus takes place, remember where we sort of ended, where there is this riot in the city of Ephesus, and Paul escapes with his life. He is pretty nervous about what's going on, and he heads back up into this region again. He goes back down to check on the people in Corinth again, and then he says, feels called to go back up here one more time, and then he takes a boat back to Troas. It's in Troas where he visits the second time that you may remember this story in the book of Acts, where Paul is preaching with great intensity, and late into the night while he is giving a sermon, a teenage boy named Eutychus falls out of an open window to his death on the ground below. And then Paul goes down, puts his hands on him, prays over him. The boy comes back to life. And then in something that I find remarkable, Paul says, "Now, where was I in my sermon?" And he finishes. So all that takes place. Then Paul says, what we hear about right before the passage that I read this morning, as he says, the day of Pentecost is coming. I want to be back in Jerusalem for Pentecost. That is important to me to go back there. And so he says, get me on a ship. I need to head back to Jerusalem. And so he makes his way down the coast a little bit. He stops at the island of Lesbos, and then he sails, eventually bypassing Ephesus, and he goes to this town called Miletus, right here. And at this point, he calls for a group of elders or leaders in the church from Ephesus, just to the north. It's about a 2.5-day walk, about 30-some miles. And he invites them to come down and join him in Miletus, and that's where we started with the scripture passage this morning. So, let's talk about Miletus for a moment. Miletus is a very old city by the time that Paul gets there. In fact, it's a city that is known in the Western world as being one of the cradles of the Western philosophical movement. You think about Athens, and Miletus is another place where there is a lot of great deal of thought that is going on. This is before the time of Socrates, even. So this is a place that is very much into the exchange of information and ideas. People are being challenged. Some of the best minds in the world are gathering there, and they're debating, and they're having discourse about what they are learning about. They are talking about things that are very advanced for their time. They are talking about the cosmos. They are talking about the origin of the earth and species. I mean, they are having very deep conversations for a time that is hundreds of years even before Paul arrives on the scene. There are people who are one of the first to form a street grid, street system, which begs the question, why couldn't we do that in Boston? But they did it in Miletus thousands of years before that. So all of this is happening in Miletus, and this is the city that Paul ventures into at this time. One of the other things that is really fascinating about Miletus is that there is a group there, a thriving community of people that sometimes Paul and sometimes Luke refer to as the God-fearers. Now, you may notice if you read through the book of Acts or in some of Paul's letters, he'll talk about those who fear God. And it's not just, it's said sort of in a generic sort of believer's way, like we are all God-fearers to some degree. No, when Paul and Luke talk about the God-fearers or those who fear God, we're talking about a very small group of people. And that is those people who are Greek or Gentile, aka non-Jews, who have adopted the Jewish way of living and the Jewish faith. And they are called the God-fearers. They will never be truly Jews because they were not born into a Jewish family, and the men, in most situations, will have chosen not to be circumcised, but they follow the Mosaic law, and they worship God, and they observe the Sabbath, and they, to an extent, follow some of the dietary rules. And so in basic, to your appearance and mine, it would look like they are observant Jews. But they are not technically Jews. They are God-fearers. And that is what they are called. Now, interestingly, Paul found that when he was doing his missionary journeys, one of the groups of people that was most receptive to his message about Jesus was the God-fearers, which stands to reason that if you are approaching a group of people who are already compelled by the God of Israel and you are interested in learning more about that, but all of a sudden Paul is now sharing a message that says, oh, and by the way, it's not just for those who were born into a Jewish family, but we are including now the Gentiles, and the circle is being drawn bigger and bigger. They find Paul's message about God and about Christ very compelling, and they want to get on board with that. And so the God-fearers apparently made up a sizable demographic in the city of Miletus, and so they were very appreciative and receptive to Paul's message when his teachings were shared there. So much so were these people a part of the community that in the ancient theater in Miletus, there was a bench reserved for them, and it bears the inscription today that says that this is the place for the God-fearers, or the God-fearing Jews, as they were called in that community. This is a space reserved for them. And I think it's noteworthy that this was not in the far reaches of the nosebleed seats, but it was in the center of the seating area in the theater. So for you to be able to envision this a little bit and to see that inscription, I've prepared a short video. It's about 90 seconds long. So let's take a look at Miletus today. So Paul arrives in Miletus. He's on his way to Jerusalem for Pentecost. It's noteworthy, I think, that he skips over Ephesus. Now, he says it's because he's in a hurry and he thinks that if he stops there, he's going to be detained for a few days. I also can't help but wonder if the fact that he almost died when he was there last time makes it a little bit easier of a stop to skip over. But he ends up there and he calls for those elders to come down. And so we've got some of the early church leaders from Ephesus that come down, and Paul gives this very impassioned goodbye speech. He talks to them about always trying to do his best, by trying to set an example and live a life that is honoring Jesus Christ and all that he does. He says to them, hey, in the future, there are going to be people who will come to you, and they are going to pretend to be people who are very devout and pious in their beliefs, but they are going to be people who are actually wolves in sheep's clothing, and they are going to be consumed by their desire for power, so be on guard for them, be careful about them. And he says, but I just need you to keep the faith. Stay the course. Continue to honor Christ and his teachings and what we have done together. And I need to entrust this to you because I am likely to never see you again. And he says this because he knows, and I don't know if you picked up on that when I was reading it, but he knows that in every city that he goes to, he has faced jail time, persecution, or both. And it's just seeming to ramp up more and more with each stop along the way. It's very reminiscent, I think, that if we are reading about Jesus talking to his disciples in the days when he is preparing to make his way to Jerusalem for the last time, where he says, I don't know what the future holds exactly, but I have a feeling it's going to get worse before it gets better. Paul ends up, his gut is right about this. He ends up going to Jerusalem for the Passover, but before he gets too far along, he's actually imprisoned, he's beaten by a mob. He says he wants a trial, and he wants to stand before the emperor, the Roman emperor. As a Roman citizen, he says, I deserve a fair trial because I am being accused of things that I did not do anything unlawfully. I have just disagreed with the powers that be in the tradition that I am from, and therefore my life is sought. He ends up going to Rome, and legend holds that he was beheaded there around the year 64. So he's not wrong in what he anticipates coming up in the future. It's not about a life where he's on a collision course with death and this is his desire. He doesn't have a martyr's complex. He just knows, much like Christ, that if I stay true to the things that I am called to do, this is likely to be the inevitable outcome. So Paul gives this beautiful speech. He shares it with these leaders of the church in Ephesus, and he invites them to stay true, to stay the course, to honor what they have been working toward together. And here's the interesting thing. I'm not sure that anything all that fascinating after that moment happens in Miletus. But here's what we know about this city. In Paul's time, Miletus not only was well known for all of the philosophical groundwork that they did, but it was a city known for its two massive and very productive, lucrative harbors. That theater that you saw in the film, on either side of that, within a few hundred yards, used to be these ancient harbors. That theater was on a peninsula. Today, it stands miles from the coastland. The Meander River, which is, by the way, where we get the word meander from, the Meander River, which meanders through Asia Minor, emptied into those harbors before making its way out into the Aegean Sea. And today, those rivers have filled with so much silt that it has built dry land again, all the way out miles to the coastline. And I think what stood out to me as I visited Miletus, and I looked at that inscription on that bench, is that a city that is now reduced to rubble and rivers that have now become dry land have been outlived by the message that Paul and the early Christians shared in that place. Think about that for a second. Amanda pulled out postcards from an antique store. Stephen opened us in worship with a prayer about the legacy and this lineage of faith that we are a part of. And this message that Paul preached in a city known for its harbors and known for its beautiful architecture now has no harbors and no architecture left to speak of. The only thing that remains, and the reason that this place is significant to us, is because that a message that was shared there about the grace of Jesus Christ has outlived everything else. That prevailed and persevered when nothing else could. Not nature, not man-made artifacts. As we wrap up this series on Paul, I think that that's a fitting place for us to remember what our responsibility is. We didn't talk about all of these stops that Paul made just for the geography lesson or just for the history lesson. This is a part of our story. The Jewish people have been so good about sharing their story. If you look in the Old Testament, the deeper you get into the Hebrew Bible, the more they go back and talk about their story from the beginning. And we as Christians don't always do as good of a job at that. But this is a part of our story too. The part that Paul did, the places that he visited, the messages that he preached, we are recipients of today because we are a part of that story and somebody shared that with us. And so as Paul leaves the elders of Ephesus in the city of Miletus, we are left with the same charge. Stay true to the gospel. Hold fast to what you believe in. Cling to the message of hope in Jesus Christ and share that message with others. This is our gift. This is our responsibility. This is how we continue to pass along a story because it is our turn, it is our chapter in sharing that message. And how we deliver that on to others matters. Let's remember the great gift that we have received. This message that has outlasted cities and civilizations, rivers and waterways. This message has endured. It is part of our legacy. It is part of our story. It is our responsibility and our blessing to share. As we prepare to come to the table today, I invite you to consider our place in that story as we prepare to receive this meal. Let us pray.